In the spring of 1980, George Hadley did something that nobody in Millbrook County had seen a farmer do before, and most of them hoped never to see again. He planted trees, not in an orchard, not in a woodlot at the back of his property, where trees had always been tolerated as a thing that happened at the edges of useful land. He planted them deliberately, methodically, in rows along the windward edges of his farm. The north boundary, the west boundary, the long exposed flank that faced the open country where the weather came from. He planted them 12 feet apart, and he planted them in double rows, and he planted a mix of species the way he had read you were supposed to: taller trees on the outside, shorter dense shrubs on the inside. A living wall that would, if everything went according to plan, take 15 years to reach its full usefulness. 15 years. His neighbors noted this with the particular amusement of people who measure farming in seasons and consider anything beyond the next harvest to be speculation. George was 41 years old in 1980. He had farmed his 300 acres in Millbrook County for 16 years, having taken over from his father at 25 with the same land, the same soil, and a great deal of the same stubbornness. He was a quiet man, not given to explaining himself at length, which was a quality that served him well in most circumstances, and was about to make the next 15 years considerably more difficult. He had read about windbreaks and shelterbelts the previous winter, not casually, but thoroughly, the way he read anything he thought might matter. He had found papers from the agricultural universities and read them cover to cover. He had written to an extension office 2 states over, and received a packet of information that he had gone through with a pencil, marking the passages that seemed most relevant to Millbrook County's particular geography and wind patterns. He had studied the research from the Dust Bowl era, from the Prairie States Forestry Project, from the long, careful science of people who had watched wind destroy crops for decades and had worked out, with the patience of people who take the long view, what could be done about it. What could be done about it, the science said, was trees. A properly planted shelter belt could reduce wind speed across a field by up to 50% for a distance of 10 times the height of the trees. It could reduce soil erosion. It could retain moisture. It could protect crops at their most vulnerable, the early weeks when the plants were young and the root systems were shallow, and a sustained wind could lay a whole field flat before anyone had the chance to do anything about it. The cost was real. The rows of trees would take land out of production. There would be shading at the field margins. There would be competition for moisture in dry years at the edges. George had calculated all of this carefully and had decided, after a winter of reading and thinking, that the cost was worth it. He started planting in April 1980 and did not make an announcement about it. The announcement made itself. Millbrook County was the kind of farming community where what a man did on his own land was technically his own business, and practically everyone's business simultaneously. And by the end of the first week, there was not a farmer in the county who did not know that George Hadley was planting trees along his field edges and had some kind of theory about it. The theories his neighbors developed about George's theory were varied and creative. Carl Briggs, who farmed the adjacent property to the north, drove slowly past the new plantings on his way to the co-op and told everyone there that George had finally lost his mind, planting trees on good arable ground, pulling productive acres out of corn to grow things that wouldn't pay for 40 years if they paid at all. It was the kind of decision, Carl said, that you made when you had more time than sense. Pete Voss, who had farmed in Millbrook County for 30 years and considered himself a reliable authority on most things agricultural, explained to anyone who would listen that the shade from those trees was going to cost George yield at every field margin for as long as the trees were standing. You didn't put shade on corn. Corn needed light. Everyone knew this. What George was doing was voluntarily reducing his own productivity to grow something that produced nothing, and Pete Voss could not think of a single good reason for it. Others were less measured. The phrase tree hugger began circulating, applied to George with the particular fondness of people who mean it as a joke and also mean it as a judgment. It was said at the co-op and at the grain elevator and at the Millbrook County Agricultural Show and at the kind of social gatherings where farming men talked about farming. It was never said to George's face, because George was a man people respected even when they thought he was wrong, and saying it to his face would have required a directness that most of them preferred to avoid. George heard it anyway. Small towns carry sound efficiently. He did not respond. He finished planting his north boundary in April, his west boundary in May, and the long exposed flank through June. He watered the saplings through the dry weeks of that first summer, with the attention of someone who understood that what he had planted would not begin to pay for itself for a decade and a half, and that the only way to get to a decade and a half was to keep the trees alive in the meantime. His neighbors planted their corn and watched their field edges, and calculated what those rows of trees were costing George in lost production, and shook their heads with the satisfaction of people who have been proven right before anything has actually been proven. The years passed the way years pass in farming country, in seasons, each one distinct, each one adding something to the long conversation between a man and his land. George's trees grew, slowly at first, the way trees grow when they are young and the ground is new to them, then with increasing confidence as the root systems deepened and the canopy began to fill. By the mid-1980s, the north boundary was a proper hedgerow, dense at the base and reaching 8 feet at the tallest points. By 1990, the west boundary had become something you could call a windbreak without exaggeration, the double row of trees standing 15 feet high, the shrub layer below filling in the gaps, the whole structure doing quietly and consistently what George had read it would do. His field margins were slightly shadier than his neighbors. His edge rows yielded slightly less than his central rows. These things were real, and his neighbors noted them with quiet satisfaction. What his neighbors did not note, because it was harder to measure and easier to ignore, was that George's topsoil was moving less than theirs in the dry, windy springs, that his young corn was standing more upright in the weeks after planting when the winds came across the open county, that his soil moisture at the field margins was holding better than the open, exposed ground on the other side of his property lines. These things were happening. They were not dramatic. They did not make for good conversation at the co-op. They accumulated quietly, the way the benefits of a good long-term decision tend to accumulate, in a language that only shows itself fully when something goes wrong. Something went wrong in the summer of 1995. The storm came on a Wednesday night in late June, which was the worst possible time. The corn was at its most vulnerable, 8 weeks out of the ground, the stalks not yet thick enough to stand serious wind, the root systems still developing, the plants at exactly the stage where a sustained battering wind could do the most damage and the least of it could be recovered from. It was not a tornado. It was something in some ways more destructive, a derecho, a line of severe thunderstorms moving fast across the county with straight-line winds that the Weather Service later measured at 73 miles per hour at their peak. It moved through Millbrook County in 90 minutes and left behind it a landscape that looked, in the gray morning light that followed, like something had decided to demonstrate what wind could do to a corn crop that had nowhere to hide. George stood at the edge of his north field at 6 in the morning and looked at what the storm had done. His corn was damaged. He was not going to pretend otherwise, and he did not try to. The outer rows along the field edges had taken a beating, stalks bent, some broken, the evidence of a serious wind event visible and real. He walked the rows carefully, assessing, counting, calculating what the losses were going to look like at harvest. The losses were real. They were also, compared to what he found when he walked to his property line and looked north at Carl Briggs's field, minor. Carl's corn was flat, not bent flat. Row after row of corn plants laid down by the wind like something had swept a hand across the field in the dark, the stalks broken at the base or bent past recovery, The whole field a catalog of what 73-mile-per-hour wind does to a corn crop with nothing standing between it, and 300 miles of open country. Carl was standing at the edge of his field when George arrived at the boundary fence. He was not saying anything. There was nothing to say. The field said everything. Pete Voss's west field was the same. The Callaway brothers to the south had lost the better part of their acreage. Everywhere George looked, in every direction where his trees did not stand, the corn was down. And everywhere his trees stood, the north boundary, the west boundary, the long exposed flank, his corn was standing too. Damaged at the margins, yes. Bent in places, yes. But standing, rooted, recoverable. 15 years of growth and patience, and being called a tree hugger standing between George Hadley's harvest and the worst wind Millbrook County had seen in a generation. George walked his fields for 2 hours that morning. Then he went home and had breakfast and made a list. The list was not of his own losses. It was of what his neighbors were going to need. He spent the rest of that week helping. He did not make a speech about it. He did not call a meeting. He did not stand at the co-op and explain to the men who had spent 15 years calling him a tree hugger what a shelter belt was, and what it did, and why he had planted one, and what had just proven him right beyond any reasonable argument. He did none of those things because they were not the things that needed doing. What needed doing was the replanting. George had contacts at the University Extension Office that he had maintained for 15 years. Since the winter he had first written to them asking about windbreaks. He called them the morning after the storm and explained what had happened in Millbrook County. He asked about saplings, what species, what quantities, what the fastest establishing varieties were for this soil type and climate. He took notes. He made more calls. By the end of the week he had sourced enough saplings to plant shelter belts on 6 neighboring farms and had arranged for them to be delivered at cost. Then he knocked on doors. He came to Carl Briggs first, because Carl had been his neighbor for 16 years, and because Carl's field had taken the worst of it, and because Carl was the kind of man who, George sensed, had already done the arithmetic in his own mind, and arrived at conclusions he was not going to need help reaching. Carl opened the door and looked at George for a moment. "I know," Carl said. "I know you know," George said. "I've got saplings coming, enough for your north and west boundaries. I can show you what to plant where if you want." Carl looked at him. Then he looked past him at his own fields, still lying flat in the June morning. "Why would you do that?" Carl said. George thought about it for a moment. "Because you're my neighbor," he said, "and because the trees take 15 years to grow and you might as well start now." He went to Pete Voss and the Callaway brothers and 4 other farms that week with the same offer. Some of them accepted immediately. Some of them took a day to think about it and came back with yes. None of them said no. They planted through July of 1995, George moving from farm to farm, showing his neighbors what he had learned 15 years earlier from papers and extension office packets, and a winter of careful reading, teaching them how to space the rows and which species to plant in which position, and how to water the saplings through the first dry summer, and what to expect in year 3, and year 5, and year 10. He did not mention the storm while he was doing this. He did not mention the 15 years. He did not mention tree hugger or productivity or shade. He talked about roots and wind and soil, and the long, patient arithmetic of a decision that pays itself back over decades. He talked about it the way he had always talked about farming, as a thing you did carefully, with the future in mind, because the land was going to be here long after you were finished with it, and it deserved to be left better than you found it. The saplings went in through July and into August, 12 feet apart, double rows, taller species on the outside, dense shrubs on the inside. The same way George had planted his own 15 years before. Carl Briggs shook George's hand at the end of the last day of planting, standing at the edge of his north field with dirt on both their boots and the new saplings in their rows behind them, small and tentative and full of the long, slow promise of things that take time. "I should have listened 15 years ago," Carl said. George looked at the saplings. "You're listening now," he said. "That's the part that matters." The saplings Carl Briggs planted in the summer of 1995 were 15 feet tall by 2010. By 2015, they were a proper shelter belt, dense, established, doing the quiet work of standing between a farm and whatever the weather decided to send across the open county. George Hadley retired in 2008 at 69. He sold the farm to a young couple from the next county who had done their research and specifically wanted land with established shelter belts. They paid a premium for it. The trees that the county had spent 15 years laughing at turned out to be, among other things, a selling point. George drove past his old farm occasionally in the years after he sold it. He always slowed down at the north boundary where his first trees had gone in April of 1980. When he was 41 years old and certain about something that nobody around him was ready to believe yet. The trees were 40 feet tall by then. You could hear the wind in them from the road, that particular sound of moving air through a canopy, the sound of something doing its job. Behind them the fields were quiet, the way fields behind a good shelter belt are always quiet. The wind broken and slowed and sent up and over rather than straight through. George would sit in his car for a moment and listen to that sound. Then he would drive home, satisfied in the way that only a very patient man can be satisfied. Not with the vindication, which had never been the point, but with the simple fact of the trees being there, standing, working, doing what he had always known they would do for anyone who cared to plant them and wait long enough to find out.